I'm Yudi.
I'm Bianca.
I'm Martha.
And I'm Jada. And we did Chapter 6, Descriptive Research.
Objectivity in research. In order to maintain objectivity in their research, one should define behavior being studied in a precise manner, divide periods of observation into small segments and record the differences in behavior for those segments, evaluate the behavior observed on a rating scale, have multiple people rate the behavior separately without knowing others' ratings, and train the raters to use specific criteria for rating and keep training them until consistent ratings are given for a behavior observed if possible. Correlational research. A correlational study examines the extent to which variations in one characteristic are connected to variations in other characteristics. A correlation will exist if, when one variable is increased, the other variables increase or decrease according to the original variable's movements. There are many variables that could possibly be studied, such as test scores, behavior patterns, fertility rates, measures of health and longevity, etc. There are three types of developmental designs. The first type of developmental design is a cross-sectional study in which people from several different age groups are observed and their results are compared. The second type, a longitudinal study, is when a single group of people are followed and studied over the course of a significant period of time, such as months or years, and the necessary data is collected at various times. The third type of developmental design, a cohort sequential study, is when researchers follow two or more different age groups over a period of time and observe the differences in their behaviors through the data collected. Survey research and methods. Survey research involves acquiring information about one or more groups of people by asking them questions about themselves and analyzing the results. In a structured interview, the researcher asks certain pre-prepared questions and nothing else. However, in a semi-structured interview, the researcher will ask certain questions along with follow-up questions to probe their subject's thoughts and reasoning. Structured and semi-structured interviews are both part of face-to-face interviews. Paper and pencil questionnaires are another survey research method, which could possibly save the research team both time and money. There are also telephone interviews, which are a non-contact variation of the face-to-face interview. However,
When planning and conducting interviews in a quantitative study, it is important to take these steps into consideration. Limit questions of those that will directly answer your research question. Consider how you can quantify responses. You will be able to assign numerical codes to responses. Restrict each question to a single idea. Don't try to get too much information in a single question. Consider asking a few questions that will elicit qualitative information. People's responses to a few open-ended questions may provide additional insights into the numerical data you obtain. Consider how you might use a computer to streamline the process. Some software programs let you record interviews onto a laptop and transform the conversations into written text. Pilot test the questions. Fine-tune your questions before you begin systematic data collection. Ask a few volunteers to answer them in a pilot study. Courteously introduce yourself to a potential participant and explain the general purpose of your study. Motivate people to want to help you. Save controversial questions for later in the interview. Seek clarifying info when necessary. Be alert for responses that are vague or may yield additional info if needed. When constructing and administering questionnaire, you should keep it short. Keep the respondent's task simple. Try not to use open-ended questions. Provide specific instructions. Use simple, clear language. Give rationale for any items whose purpose may be unclear. Each question should have a purpose. Check for accidental assumptions in your questions. Example, how many cigarettes do you smoke a day? Instead say, do you smoke cigarettes first? Word your questions in ways that don't give clues about more desirable responses. Determine in advance how you will code the responses. Develop a plan for recoding participants' responses into numerical data. Check for consistency. Conduct at least one pilot test. Make sure every question is essential for you to address the research problem. Make the questionnaire attractive and professional looking. Using technology to facilitate question administration and data analysis. When participants are in the same location that you are, have them respond to the questionnaire directly on a tablet or laptop. If participants are at a diverse location, send emails to ask for their responses. If you use paper mail delivery instead of email, use a word processing program. Use a scanner to facilitate data tabulation. and use a computer database to keep track of who has responded and who hasn't. In order to maximize your return rate for a questionnaire, consider the timing. Stay away from peak holiday times. Make a good first impression. Motivate potential respondents. Maybe send a letter soliciting people's cooperation before actually sending them the questionnaire. Personalize the letter for the recipient. Letter describes potential value of the study. It assures that the questionnaire won't take too much time. If mailing, include a self-addressed envelope with return postage. And finally, offer to send the results of your study.
Lastly, be gently persistent. Experts say that following up with 2 reminders increases response rate, and it should be noted that this is the only point in your research where you should be referencing participant names in order to find out who still needs to give a response. Using the internet to collect data for a descriptive study. Some researchers collect descriptive data directly on the internet. However, each project should still be approved by the appropriate institutional review board and should have some form of informed consent procedures. A popular website for survey data collection would be SurveyMonkey. Some advantages could include large sample size, it's cost-effective, and it's fast and efficient. However, this must still comply with the same ethical standards given to regular face-to-face data collection, and it should be noted that sampling might be biased if the participation is open to all internet users. Choosing a sample in a descriptive study. Researchers want to determine the nature of how things are. To do so, they select a sample of the population. Throughout your paper, you should not be referencing the population, but rather using words that describe the sample, such as selected, representative, typical, certain, or random of sample. The sample should show characteristics of the total population and the relationships between their different perspectives. Sampling design. There are 2 different types. Probability sampling, which is chosen by random selection. A popular method would be the table of random numbers, in which individuals are randomly selected from a table, and you can easily find this online. Another type would be non-probability sampling, in which there is no way of predicting or guaranteeing each element of the population will be represented. Some different types would be convenience sampling, also called accidental sampling, where you take people who are readily available. Quota sampling, which is tailored sample that's in proportion to some characteristic or trait of a population, such as gender or income. And purposive sampling, which is most oftenly used for quantitative studies, in which you choose participants for a particular purpose. Sampling in surveys of very large populations. The sample must always be representative of the population, or the percentages would be meaningless. There are multiple stages of an area, the first being primary area selection, where the country is divided into smaller primary areas, such as states. The second being sample location selection, where each primary area is divided into smaller sample locations, like specific towns. Chunk selection, in which sample locations are divided into even smaller chunks and have identifiable boundaries, like a stream or the edge of a city block. Segment selection, where chunks are divided into segment areas containing a small number of dwellings. And housing unit selection, which is approximately 4 dwellings selected randomly from each segment. Identifying a sufficient sample size. Depending on how big your population, that's how many people you will survey. So for small populations of 100 or fewer, there is no point in sampling. You should just survey the entire population. For a population size of around 500, you should be surveying half of the population. For a population size of 1,500, you should be surveying 20% of the population. And beyond approximately 5,000, the population size is irrelevant and a sample size of 400 will be adequate.
Common sources of bias in descriptive studies. A bias is an influence, condition, or set of conditions that distorts the data or conclusions drawn from that research study. A sampling bias is any factor that yields a non-representative sample of the population being studied. For example, choosing a random page in a phone book is biased. Low-income people aren't represented because of the cost of these services. Higher income people usually have unlisted numbers. Studies involving mailed questionnaires are biased. Many choose not to answer, and the generalizations are sometimes far from accurate. Instrumentation bias is ways in which particular measurement instruments slant the obtained results in one direction or another. For example, imagine that an educational researcher is interested in discovering the kind of goals that students hope to accomplish when they're at school. Many motivation researchers have speculated that students might be concerned about either A, truly mastering classroom subject matter on one hand, or B, getting good grades by any expedient means on the other. Researcher bias, the author's own expectations, values, and general belief systems. This can predispose the researcher to study certain variables and not other variables, as well as to draw certain conclusions and not other conclusions. Practical application was also described. It is acknowledging the probable presence of bias in descriptive research. Interpreting data in descriptive research. One must recognize the purpose of research is to not seek the answer to a problem in light of data that relate to the problem. And secondly, although collecting data for a study and organizing it for inspection require care and precision, extracting meaning from the data, the interpretation of the data is all important.
The end?
Yes.
Okay.